The hidden signal. Juna sat hunched over her desk, the glow of her computer screen casting a pale light across her tired face. The observatory was quiet at this hour, the only sound the faint hum of machinery and the occasional beep of equipment. She had been working late for weeks, poring over data from the deep space array, searching for anything unusual. And then she found it. A signal, unlike anything she had ever seen. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a repeating pattern buried in the cosmic noise. Her heart raced as she ran the data through her algorithms again and again, confirming what she already knew. This was no natural phenomenon. This was artificial. "Riven, you need to see this," Juna muttered to herself, grabbing her phone. She hesitated for a moment, then dialed the number she had sworn she would never use. Riven was a recluse, a hacker who had disappeared off the grid years ago. But if anyone could help her decode the signal, it was him. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Who is this?" "It's Juna. I need your help." There was a long pause. "Juna? You've got to be kidding me. What do you want?" "I found something. Something big. I can't explain it over the phone. Just meet me at the old lab. Please." Another pause, then a sigh. "Fine. But this better be worth it." An hour later, Juna stood in the dimly lit basement of an abandoned research facility. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with outdated equipment. She heard footsteps and turned to see Riven stepping out of the shadows. He looked the same as she remembered, tall, lean, with a perpetual scowl on his face. "This better be good," he said, crossing his arms. "I don't do favors for free." Juna ignored his tone and handed him a flash drive. "Just look at this." Riven plugged the drive into his laptop and began scrolling through the data. His expression shifted from annoyance to curiosity, then to something resembling awe. "Where did you get this?" "The deep space array. It's a signal, Riven, but it's not human. I've never seen anything like it." He nodded, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "It's encrypted, heavily. But I think I can crack it. Give me some time." As Riven worked, Juna's mind raced. What if this was it? The proof she had been searching for her entire career. Proof that we were not alone in the universe. But as the hours passed, a sense of unease settled over her. What if this signal wasn't a friendly greeting? What if it was something else entirely? Meanwhile, Cale sat in a cramped apartment, staring at his laptop. He was a journalist, or at least he used to be. These days, he mostly wrote clickbait articles to pay the bills. But he had a nose for a story, and something about the recent buzz in the scientific community had caught his attention. Rumors of a major discovery, whispers of a signal from deep space, and then there were the government types. Men in suits showing up at observatories, asking questions, shutting down access. Cale knew a cover-up when he saw one, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Hey, it's Cale. I need a favor. Can you get me into the Deep Space Arrays database? I think there's something big going on, and I want to know what it is." Back in the lab, Riven finally leaned back in his chair. "I've got something." Juna rushed over. "What is it?" "It's a message, but it's not in any language I've ever seen. It's mathematical, like a code. But there's something else. A pattern. It's repeating, but it's not random. It's counting down." "Counting down to what?" Riven shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's coming. And soon." Juna felt a chill run down her spine. "We need to tell someone. The government, the scientific community. Someone needs to know about this." Riven laughed bitterly. "And what do you think they'll do? They'll lock us up and take the data. No, if we're going to figure this out, we need to do it ourselves." Juna hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but we need to be careful. If this is as big as I think it is, we're not the only ones looking for answers." As the night wore on, Juna and Riven worked tirelessly, piecing together the fragments of the signal. But they weren't alone. Kale was closing in, following the trail of secrecy and lies. And somewhere, in the shadows, others were watching, waiting for the right moment to make their move. The signal was just the beginning. But what it meant, and what it would bring, no one could yet say. The forgotten facility. Torin sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the old photograph in his hands. It was faded, the edges curled with age, but the image was still clear. A group of soldiers, standing in front of a massive concrete structure buried deep in the desert. He was younger then, his face unlined, his posture stiff with military pride. The facility behind them was known only as Site Omega, a place that didn't officially exist. And now, after all these years, it was calling him back. The phone call had come in the middle of the night, jolting him awake. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Site Omega has been reactivated. You need to see this. Torin had tried to ask questions, but the line went dead before he could get any answers. Now, as he packed his bag, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Sarah adjusted her glasses and squinted at the microfilm reader. The archives were musty and dimly lit, but she had spent enough time here to navigate the rows of dusty boxes with ease. She was a historian, specializing in the Cold War era, and she had stumbled upon something strange. A series of declassified documents referencing a secret program called Project Starlight. The details were vague, but one name kept appearing. Site Omega. She had heard rumors about the place, whispers of experiments, of contact with extraterrestrial beings, but nothing concrete. Until now, the documents she had found hinted at something far bigger than she had imagined. A hidden facility buried in the desert, where the government had been studying alien technology. And now, it seemed, the facility was active again. Sarah's heart raced as she gathered her notes. She needed to see this place for herself, but she couldn't do it alone. She needed someone who knew the facility, someone who had been there. And that's when she found Torin's name. Dax wiped the grease from his hands and tossed the wrench onto the workbench. His workshop was cluttered with half-finished projects, pieces of machinery that no one else could understand. He had always been good with his hands, a natural engineer, but his skills had gotten him into trouble more than once. Like the time he had worked at Site Omega. He had been young then, eager to prove himself. The facility had been a dream job, a chance to work on cutting-edge technology, but it hadn't taken long for him to realize that something was off. The experiments, the secrecy, the things he had seen. It had all been too much. He had quit abruptly, disappearing into the shadows. But he had never forgotten what he had witnessed. When Sarah showed up at his door, he was hesitant. But the mention of Site Omega was enough to pique his interest. "Why now?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Why after all these years?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, "but something's happening, and I think you're the only one who can help me figure it out." Dax sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right, but if we're doing this, we're doing it my way. No government, no red tape, just us." The desert stretched out before them, endless and barren. Torin drove in silence, his hands tight on the wheel. Sarah sat beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon. Dax was in the back, tinkering with a handheld device he had brought along. "This should help us find the entrance," he said, holding up the device, "if it's still there." As they approached the coordinates, the landscape began to change. The sand gave way to rocky outcrops, and soon they found themselves at the base of a steep hill. Torin parked the car and stepped out, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. "This is it," he said quietly. Site Omega. The entrance was hidden, a massive steel door set into the side of the hill. It was rusted and covered in dust, but it was still intact. Dax approached it cautiously, his device beeping softly. "It's still powered," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "Someone's been here recently." With some effort, they managed to pry the door open, revealing a dark tunnel that led deep underground. The air was cold and stale, and the walls were lined with pipes and wires. Torin led the way, his military training kicking in as he scanned for threats. But the facility was eerily quiet. As they ventured deeper, they began to find signs of recent activity, fresh footprints in the dust, discarded equipment, and lights that flickered to life as they passed. "Someone's definitely been here," Sarah whispered, her voice echoing in the empty corridors. Finally, they reached the central chamber. It was a massive room, filled with strange machinery and monitors that glowed with an otherworldly light. In the center of the room was a large, circular platform, covered in intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with energy. "This is it," Dax said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where they did the experiments. But it's different. Something's changed." Torin stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the symbols. "These aren't human," he said. "This is alien technology. But why would they reactivate it now?" Before anyone could answer, the room was suddenly bathed in a bright, blinding light. The platform began to hum, the symbols glowing brighter and brighter. And then, with a deafening roar, the platform activated, sending a beam of light shooting up into the ceiling. "We need to go," Dax shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. "Now." But it was too late. The beam of light intensified, and the room began to shake. Torin stumbled, his hand reaching for his weapon. But as the light enveloped them, he realized that there was no enemy to fight. This was something far beyond his understanding. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. The room was silent once more, the platform dark and still. But something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. "What just happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Dax shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know, but I think we just woke something up." As they made their way back to the surface, none of them spoke. The weight of what they had witnessed hung heavy in the air. But one thing was clear. Site Omega was no longer just a relic of the past. It was alive. And whatever had been awakened, it was only the beginning. The awakened artifact. Lyra adjusted the straps of her backpack and squinted against the sun as she climbed the rocky slope. The dig site was remote, nestled in a valley surrounded by jagged peaks. It had taken her weeks to secure the permits and assemble a team. But now that she was here, she could feel the excitement bubbling in her chest. This was it, the discovery of a lifetime. The artifact had been found by a local shepherd who had stumbled upon it while searching for a lost goat. It was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. A smooth metallic disc, about the size of a dinner plate, covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. It was ancient, that much was clear, but its origin was a mystery. As she reached the top of the slope, she saw Orin waiting for her. He was a linguist, specializing in ancient languages, and he had been just as intrigued by the artifact as she was. "Any progress?" she asked, brushing the dust from her hands. Orin shook his head, his brow furrowed. "Not yet. The symbols are unlike anything I've ever seen. They're not just decorative. They're a language, but it's alien. I can't make sense of it." Lyra nodded, her excitement tempered by frustration. They had been working on the artifact for days, but it remained stubbornly enigmatic. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something monumental. Vesper watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows of a nearby cliff. She had been sent to retrieve the artifact, and she wasn't about to let a couple of academics stand in her way. The organization she worked for had been tracking the artifact for years, and now that it had been found, they wanted it secured, by any means necessary. She adjusted the scope of her rifle, her eyes narrowing as she observed the dig site. There were only a handful of people there: Lyra, Orin, and a few assistants. It would be easy to take them out, but Vesper preferred to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. If she could get the artifact without a fight, all the better. She waited until nightfall, when the camp was quiet and the others were asleep. Then, moving like a shadow, she made her way to the tent where the artifact was being kept. It was unguarded, a careless oversight on Lyra's part. Vesper slipped inside, her gloved hands reaching for the artifact. But as soon as she touched it, the carvings began to glow. A low hum filled the air, and the artifact seemed to vibrate in her hands. Vesper froze, her instincts screaming at her to drop it and run. But before she could move, the artifact activated. A beam of light shot out from the disk, projecting a holographic image into the air. It was a map, but not of any place Vesper recognized. The symbols shifted and changed, forming patterns that seemed to tell a story. And then, a voice, deep, resonant, and utterly alien, began to speak. Vesper stumbled back, her heart pounding. This was more than she had bargained for. She grabbed the artifact and bolted from the tent, the hologram flickering and fading as she ran. Lyra woke to the sound of shouting. She sat up, disoriented, and saw Orin standing in the doorway of her tent, his face pale. "It's gone," he said, his voice trembling. "The artifact. It's gone." Lyra's heart sank. She scrambled to her feet and followed Orin to the tent where the artifact had been stored. The space was empty, the only sign of intrusion a faint glow that lingered in the air. "What happened?" she asked, her mind racing. "I don't know," Orin replied. "But look at this." He pointed to the ground, where the carvings from the artifact had been burned into the dirt. They were glowing faintly, pulsing with an otherworldly light. Lyra knelt down, her fingers brushing the symbols. They were warm to the touch, and as she traced them, she felt a strange sensation, a connection, as if the artifact was calling to her. "We need to find it," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever this is, it's not just an artifact. It's a message, and we need to understand it." Vesper moved quickly through the night, the artifact tucked securely in her pack. She had no idea what it was or what it could do, but she knew one thing. It was dangerous, and she needed to get it to her superiors as soon as possible. But as she made her way down the mountain, she began to feel a strange pull, as if the artifact was trying to guide her. The symbols on its surface glowed brighter, and the voice she had heard earlier returned, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. It was unsettling, but Vesper was a professional. She pushed the fear aside and focused on her mission. She reached the rendezvous point just before dawn, where a helicopter was waiting to take her to the organization's headquarters. But as she approached, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. The artifact was glowing brighter than ever, and the holographic map had reappeared, projecting itself onto the ground in front of her. Vesper hesitated, her instincts warring with her training. She had been told to retrieve the artifact, but no one had mentioned anything about it being alive. And now, as she stared at the map, she realized that it wasn't just a map, it was a warning. The symbols shifted, forming a sequence that seemed to count down. And then the voice spoke again, this time in a language Vesper could understand. "The awakening has begun. The reckoning is near." Vesper's blood ran cold. She didn't know what the artifact was trying to tell her, but she knew one thing. She couldn't hand it over. Not yet. Not until she understood what it meant. Lyra and Orin followed the trail of glowing symbols, which led them to the edge of a cliff. Below, they saw Vesper standing in a clearing, the artifact in her hands. "Stop!" Lyra shouted, her voice echoing in the stillness. Vesper turned, her eyes narrowing as she saw them approaching. "Stay back," she warned, her hand moving to the weapon at her side. "We just want to talk," Orin said, holding up his hands. "We need to understand what's happening. That artifact, it's not just a relic. It's alive." Vesper hesitated, her grip on the artifact tightening. "I don't know what it is," she admitted, "but it's dangerous, and I can't let you have it." "We don't want to take it," Lyra said, taking a step closer. "We want to help. Whatever this is, it's bigger than all of us. And if we don't figure it out, something terrible is going to happen." Vesper looked down at the artifact, which was still glowing faintly. The symbols pulsed in time with her heartbeat, and she felt the pull again, stronger this time. "All right," she said finally, "but we do this my way. No one else can know." Lyra nodded, relief washing over her. "Deal." As the three of them stood there, the artifact began to glow brighter, the holographic map reappearing in the air. The symbols shifted and changed, forming a new pattern. And then, the voice spoke again, its tone urgent. "The reckoning is near. Prepare." Lyra, Orin, and Vesper exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever was coming, they knew one thing. They were running out of time. The final reckoning. Nyx stood on the rooftop of an abandoned warehouse, the city skyline stretching out before her. The air was thick with tension, the kind that came before a storm. She adjusted the comms device in her ear and glanced at the small group gathered around her. They were a ragtag bunch, scientists, hackers, former soldiers, and ordinary people who had been drawn together by a shared purpose. They called themselves the Resistance, though Nyx preferred to think of them as survivors. "We've got maybe an hour before they make their move," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We need to be ready." Zora stepped forward, her face pale but determined. She had been a scientist once, working on cutting-edge technology, but that felt like a lifetime ago. Now she was one of the leaders of the Resistance, using her knowledge to fight against the alien threat. "The signal is getting stronger," she said, holding up a device that blinked with a steady red light. "They're coming. And when they do, we need to hit them hard." Kor, the alien defector, stood at the edge of the group, his expression unreadable. He had risked everything to warn humanity about the impending invasion, but not everyone trusted him. Nyx had vouched for him, though even she wasn't sure if it was enough. "They'll come through the rift," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's the only way they can bring their full force to bear. If we can close it, we might stand a chance." "Might," one of the Resistance members muttered, his voice tinged with fear. "It's the best we got," Nyx snapped, her eyes blazing. "We don't have the luxury of doubt. Not anymore." The rift. It had appeared without warning, a massive tear in the fabric of reality that hovered over the city like a dark cloud. At first, people had been fascinated, even hopeful, but that had changed when the first ships emerged, sleek alien vessels that moved with a predatory grace. They had struck quickly, targeting key infrastructure and military installations. Within days, the world had been thrown into chaos. Nyx had been one of the first to fight back. She had seen the devastation up close, had lost friends and family to the invaders, and she had vowed to make them pay. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that this was a fight they couldn't win through force alone. They needed a plan. And that's where Zora and Kor came in. Zora had been working tirelessly to decipher the alien technology, using fragments of their ships and devices to piece together a way to fight back. It was Kor who had provided the key, a device capable of closing the rift. But it would require a massive amount of energy, more than they could generate on their own. "We need to lure them in," Zora explained, her fingers flying over a holographic display. "If we can get enough of their ships close to the rift, we can use their own power sources to fuel the device. But it's risky. If they realize what we're doing, they'll destroy us," Nyx finished. "We know the risks, but it's the only shot we've got." As the Resistance prepared for the final battle, Nyx found herself thinking about the people she had lost. Her brother, who had died in the first wave of attacks. Her best friend, who had sacrificed herself to buy them time. And all the others who had fought and died for a chance at survival. She clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. This was it, the final reckoning. The alien ships descended like a swarm of locusts, their weapons lighting up the night sky. The Resistance fought back with everything they had, their makeshift weapons and stolen technology barely holding the line. Nyx led the charge, her movements swift and precise as she took down one enemy after another. But it wasn't enough. The aliens were too many, too powerful. "Zora, now!" Nyx shouted into her comms, her voice barely audible over the roar of battle. Zora and Kor were at the heart of the Resistance's makeshift base, the device humming with energy as it absorbed power from the alien ships. "Almost there," Zora muttered, her hands trembling as she adjusted the controls. "Just a little more." Kor stood guard, his alien physiology making him a formidable fighter. But even he was struggling to hold back the tide. "Hurry," he growled, his eyes darting to the approaching enemies. Nyx fought her way to their position, her body aching with exhaustion. "We're running out of time," she said, her voice hoarse. "If this doesn't work." "It'll work," Zora said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "It has to." The device reached critical mass, its light blinding as it prepared to activate. But the aliens had realized what was happening. A massive ship descended, its weapons trained on the base. "Nyx, get down," Kor shouted, shoving her out of the way as the ship fired. The blast shook the ground, sending debris flying in all directions. Nyx scrambled to her feet, her ears ringing. "Zora!" she screamed, her heart sinking, as she saw the scientist lying motionless on the ground. Kor was already at Zora's side, his hands pressing against the wound in her side. "She's alive," he said, his voice tight. "But we need to move. Now." Nyx grabbed the device, her hands trembling as she activated the final sequence. The rift began to shudder, its edges collapsing in on itself. The alien ships were pulled into the vortex, their screams echoing through the air as they were consumed. When the dust settled, the rift was gone. The city was in ruins, but the aliens were defeated. Nyx stood amidst the wreckage, her body battered but unbroken. Zora was alive, thanks to Kor's quick thinking, but the cost had been high. Too high. "We did it," Zora whispered, her voice weak but filled with relief. "We actually did it." Nyx nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. "Yeah, we did. But this isn't over. Not yet." Kor stepped forward, his expression grim. "They'll come back. They always do. But next time, we'll be ready." Nyx clenched her fists, her resolve hardening once more. "Then we'll be ready. For whatever comes next." As the sun rose over the shattered city, the Resistance began to regroup. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. And Nyx knew that as long as there was breath in her body, she would keep fighting. For her brother, for her friends, for humanity. The final reckoning had come and gone, but the fight for survival was just beginning. The end.